If Bruce Springsteen can take it over the top, Meatloaf can take it 5 stories higher. That's how a Bat Out of Hell producer once described Meatloaf's verbose and operatic voice. After finding success on the Broadway musical Hair, Meatloaf would have a brief but memorable turn in the cult film The Rocky Horror Picture Show before becoming a true rock and roll icon off of his 1997 hit album Bat Out of Hell. But it didn't come without a cost. Often considered to be one of the most energetic performers of all time, Meatloaf would ravage his entire body, leaving everything out there on the stage each night. By 2016, he finally had to call it quits after collapsing in the middle of a performance. Constant years of touring had finally caught up with him. Now, sad news has been confirmed by his family that Meatloaf has passed away. While no cause of death was given at the time, TMZ would later reveal that Meatloaf had reportedly contracted a severe case of the coronavirus. Now, out of respect for the man's many singular accomplishments, I want to take you back through the life and times of the only man with such a unique mix of humility and humor that he actually enjoyed being called Meatloaf. So if you want to learn more about the life and story of Meatloaf, stay tuned to The Famous Life. Meatloaf was born Marvin Lee Aday on September 27, 1947 in Dallas, Texas. A chunky baby from the moment he was born, his dad took to calling him Meat almost immediately. Unfortunately, that was about the nicest thing his father ever did for him. A bitter and violent alcoholic police officer, Meatloaf's father would regularly beat him until Meatloaf's mother would divorce him. From that point forward, she took on the job of a school teacher while also raising her son all on her own. When Meatloaf headed off to school, things didn't get much better. Thanks to his size, kids would constantly tease him, including riffing him off his nickname by calling him Meatloaf. But things finally began to turn around when he took to the football field for his high school team. Suddenly, Meatloaf's immense girth was a major plus. But the craziest thing that ever happened to Meatloaf in school was when during a track and field event in his sophomore year, a 12-pound shot put landed on his head. For the rest of his life, Meatloaf would believe that this accident created his 3.5 octave range singing voice. Sadly, Meatloaf was only a teenager when his mother died of breast cancer. Shortly after her funeral, Meatloaf's father made a dramatic return when he barged into his son's bedroom, drunk as a skunk, and branding a butcher's knife. Speaking with Rolling Stone in 2018, Meatloaf told them about the event. "I rolled off the bed just as he put that knife right in the mattress. I fought for my life. Apparently, I broke 3 ribs and his nose, and left the house barefoot in a pair of gym shorts and a t-shirt." With no reason to remain in Texas, Meatloaf would pack up what little belongings he had and move to Los Angeles to find a career for himself in show business. A massive fan of both music and acting, while in high school, Meatloaf's idols had been Mick Jagger and Ethel Merman. 2 totally different people, I mean sure, but that's just how unique Meatloaf was himself. He was never only good at just one thing, but instead, he was talented in a whole bunch of different ways. Once in LA, he formed a group called Meatloaf Soul and opened for acts like Taj Mahal and Janis Joplin. But his first true success story was being cast in the Broadway musical Hair in 1968. His performance in this groundbreaking production would lead to a record contract with Motown subsidiary Rare Earth, and his first album, a 1972 project of duets with female singer Shawn Murphy under the banner Stoney and Meatloaf. When that album failed to move units, Meatloaf moved to New York City and was cast in a production of More Than You Deserve, a musical created by Jim Steinman, an individual who would become Meatloaf's most important professional collaborator. Every time Meatloaf would take the stage at the end of a night for his big number, everyone in the audience was standing on their feet to watch him perform. It was at this point that Meatloaf realized that he should hitch his star to Steinman's. From that point forward, the two formed a very tight bond, one that only strengthened when they hit the road to perform together as a part of the National Lampoon Roadshow. At that time, Steinman was playing piano for the comedy troupe, while Meatloaf was John Belushi's understudy. During their downtime on the road, Meatloaf and Steinman would write songs with one another and dream up a collaborative album. It would take some time to come together, largely because in 1975, Meatloaf would take a brief hiatus to star as Eddie in what would become a cult classic film, The Rocky Horror Picture Show. Over the years, that film's legend would grow, but by 1977, Meatloaf's biggest accomplishment was the release of his long-jesting project with Steinman titled Bat Out of Hell. At first, the album had very little impact at all. But then, months after its release, a concert video of the title track was aired on the British program The Old Grey Whistle Test. And suddenly, Meatloaf's tracks were getting spun everywhere. Millions of record sales later, and he was on his way to becoming one of the most recognizable performers in all of rock. Fans would fall hard for Meatloaf's singular ability to match his rock and roll roaring vocals with the often comic elements of Steinman's lyrics. Songs like "You Took the Words Right Out of My Mouth," 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad, and Paradise by the Dashboard Light would become not only giant hits in the moment, but cult classic tracks in the long run. Unfortunately, the resulting tour was punishing to say the least. Meatloaf ended up exhausting himself. When the pressure of creating a follow-up album hit, Meatloaf had an emotional breakdown and lost his singing voice. Worse still, contractual problems would result in him not receiving a single penny in royalties from Bat Out of Hell for years. Eventually, he'd have to declare bankruptcy. The 80s were a long and difficult decade full of albums like Dead Ringer, Bad Attitude, and Before I Stop, all of which failed to move the needle. But then in 1993, a miracle happened. Meatloaf reteamed with Steinman and finally delivered on that long-awaited sequel. Bad Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell, would sell an astonishing 14 million copies, thanks large in part to the worldwide hit single, I Would Do Anything for Love, But I Won't Do That. Arguably the song that Meatloaf would become best known for. Having now completed one of the most stunning comebacks in rock and roll history, Meatloaf was once suddenly a household name again. From that point forward, he'd continue to create music at a fairly regular clip, and he'd also embrace his other passion, acting, when he'd appear in projects like Black Dog, Crazy in Alabama, and of course, Fight Club. But keeping such a hectic schedule would eventually catch up with Meatloaf for good. Over the years, Meatloaf would put so much of his heart, soul, and energy into his performances and music that he wound up battling a long series of illnesses and injuries. For instance, back in 1978, he once broke his leg while jumping off of a stage during a performance in Ottawa, Ontario. Rather than cancel the tour and head home, he wound up finishing it from a wheelchair. Jump forward a few decades, and while performing in Pittsburgh in 2011, Meatloaf would faint on stage. Only 5 years later, he'd do so once again in Edmonton, Alberta. That would wind up being the last tour of his career. 5 years later, his friend and business partner, Jim Steinman, would pass away in 2021. At the time, Meatloaf told Rolling Stone, "I don't want to die, but I may die this year because of Jim. I'm always with him and he's right here with me now. I've always been with Jim and Jim's always been with me. We belonged heart and soul to each other. We didn't know each other. We were each other." Despite his immense sense of loss with the passing of his close friend, in recent months, Meatloaf was set to start filming a new dating series for ITV, which has to be named after his hit song, I'd Do Anything for Love, But I Won't Do That. While recovering from yet another painful back surgery, Meatloaf would pen his last post to Facebook in November of 2021, stating that he would be filming episodes of the series in early January 2022. At the time, Meatloaf was also considering hitting the studio to record a new album. Sadly, neither of these projects was meant to be. On January 21st, news would break that Meatloaf had passed away. While the cause of death wasn't immediately clear, TMZ would later report that Meatloaf was supposed to attend a business meeting this week in regards to his upcoming reality series, but the meeting was canceled after he became seriously ill with coronavirus. Upon the news of his death, there was an outpouring of support from all over. Stars as big as Cher, as well as Brian May, and a host of others would take to their social media profiles to remember how much fun they had with the man and express how gutted they were. Meatloaf is survived by his wife, Deborah Giuseppe, and his two daughters, Pearl and Amanda Aday. We here at Famous Life want to send our well wishes to them in this extremely difficult time. Meatloaf was a force to be reckoned with no matter what form his artistic expression took, and there's never been another musical superstar like him. Now, there probably never will be again. Rest in peace, Meatloaf, you will be missed. If you guys enjoyed this video, please let us know who you'd like to see covered next on The Famous Life down below, and I'll see you guys in another video. Thanks for watching.